Mormal, a large village near Bobruisk. In a large collective farm shed at the edge of the village, they were collecting single prisoners. When I got there were already over 300 people in the barn. Here I met the two commanders who had travelled with me yesterday to Skepnia in the 2nd Zis. The chauffeur was killed, but Senior Lieutenant Borisov and Lieutenant Shmatko managed to jump out and hide in the woods. An hour later they were both captured. Borisov was without a scratch, and Shmatko was shot in the left arm. The barn was guarded by a small detachment of Finns. Some knew the Russian language. These Finns in German uniforms hated Russia, Soviet power and everything that was somehow connected with Russia. They showed their hatred by swearing merciless beatings at every opportunity, and often by simply bullying the prisoners. There was no organized feeding. Once a day all the prisoners were taken to the area in front of the barn, lined up in a long column of 6 in a row, and ordered to sit down. Then a crowd of peasant women appeared with a variety of foodstuffs, mainly bread, boiled potatoes, porridge in pots, milk, boiled eggs, cucumbers, tomatoes, and other things. The Finns took the food and carried it along the seated prisoners, giving it to the end of the row, without any thought of evenly distributing the food. One row would get 2 large loaves of bread, another a dozen potatoes, another a couple of bottles of milk and 5 or 6 cucumbers. Any exchange of food between the rows was forbidden, and if anyone violated this Finnish rule, the Finns beat him and his neighbours with sticks. 50 men in the shed were easily wounded, like me or Shmatko, but there was no medical aid. If the Finns were atrocious outside, the situation inside the shed was also very difficult. The composition of the prisoners was extremely motley Red Army men of different units, loners, commanders of different ranks, from junior lieutenant to colonel, a few men in civilian clothes and, most importantly, quite a large number of green deserters. Many commanders took off their insignia and pretended to be privates. Nobody knew what was going on at the front, where the front was, where the Soviet troops were. Everyone was extremely careful in words. Everyone was afraid of each other. Everyone was hungry, nervous, frightened. The Greens behaved brazenly, aggressively, terrorizing the rest of the barn's population, often taking food, boots, tobacco, or personal items, such as watches or rings, from the more timid. There was constant bickering amongst themselves in the barn and often even fighting. By the end of the first day, the prisoners had divided into 2 clearly antagonistic groups, some of the privates, and all the Greens on the one side, led by a type nicknamed Gypsy, and the rest of the prisoners, whose tacit leader was the young artillery captain Batrakov, on the other. If the noise in the barn reached such an extent that the Finns heard it, they would rush in and beat with sticks and rifle butts those who were closer to the door. The atmosphere heated up hour after hour. On the 3rd day of our sitting in the barn, suggestions of the most radical order began to be heard. Why sit here and starve to death? There are only 24 Finns. Next time they'll bring them out for a Shemovka, we'll all rush at them at once. Well, they'll shoot a dozen or 2, and the rest will leave with their own machine guns. It is possible that such a revolution could have been the end of the matter, but at dawn, after the 3rd night, everyone was awakened by the rumble of heavy vehicles, loud shouts in German and words of command. The barn gate opened wide. From the very exit to the large, tarpaulin-covered grey trucks standing on the road, German soldiers with rifles at the ready stood in 2 almost continuous lines. A German lieutenant counted out 50 prisoners at a time, and they were escorted between these German chains into the truck. The convoy was incomprehensibly large, at least 100 soldiers, and in addition 2 vehicles with machine guns. In all, 7 trucks came for us. After loading, the tarpaulin was closed tightly and the trucks started on their way. I got into the 5th car, together with my colleagues Borisov and Shmatko. Inside it was stuffy, dusty. People were standing, holding each other and the sides of the car, swaying and falling at turns and sudden changes of speed. Where we were being taken, and how long we would be on the road, of course, no one knew, but everyone assumed that they were taking us to some camp. After almost 3 hours of travelling, we were unloaded in the yard of the city prison in Bobruisk. We were first of all divided into 2 groups, privates and commanders, starting with a junior lieutenant. The Red Army soldiers under escort were taken somewhere outside the gate, and we, the commanders, were ordered to line up in 2 rows. In total, there were 56 of us, including 1 colonel and 1 lieutenant colonel. We stood in the middle of a large prison yard filled with prisoners, but no one was allowed close to us. A German field officer appeared and said through an interpreter that we would be living in this prison for some time, until we were all taken farther away to stationary camps. For officer personnel, he said something for a few more minutes, but apparently the interpreter decided that we needed to convey only the quintessence of the speech. He said that you must all obey the rules of discipline and every order of the German guards. Those who don't obey will be shot to hell. Do you understand that? Gentlemen officers, the interpreter, a Kalmyk or Buryat by the look of him, finished the abridged translation of the long speech of the field fable with a flowery mate. This interpreter took our whole group to the 2nd floor of the main prison building and, pointing to a place at the dead end of a wide inner corridor, said, "This is your bedroom." Gentlemen officers, then he called to some big man with a kubanka on his head and said to him, "This is for your company, Katso, 56 Stalin's Falcons." The Bobruisk city prison, a 2- and 3-story building of red brick, with some towers, like an old castle, and a wide porch, was packed to the brim with prisoners, gentlemen officers, as the Red Army commanders were now called, by someone's initiative. It was said that no less than 3,000 men had already been collected here. In the large orchard and field adjoining the prison, enclosed by a newly erected double fence of barbed wire, with hastily erected guard towers, again, it was said, more than 30,000 rank and file were gathered. Replenishments arrived in groups several times a day. The commandant of the camp was a German, an Oberleutnant, an apparent invalid, who walked heavily on a stick. The whole mass of captured commanders was divided into companies of 200 to 200 to 250 men, mostly on the basis of geography. Several cells in a row, and a piece of corridor near them, everything was densely packed with people. The commanders of such companies were quick guys who somehow knew German, and almost all of them were of Mongolian or Caucasian appearance. The chief of these company commanders was nominally the German commandant of the camp, but in fact a certain Soviet major, small in stature, bald, guttural, very nervous, and always gloomy as a cloud, speaking fluent German, he with the help of 24 company officers. Led the entire administration of the camp. All prisoners were registered. A special card was filled out for each. The wounded went through a medical examination, and those who had suppuration and complications were taken somewhere. My wounds appeared to be in excellent condition, and after dressing them I could almost no longer feel them. Meals were twice a day, in the morning and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Both times I was given a litre of liquid soup with millet and absolutely rotten stinking warbler. It was possible to eat this soup only with one's fingers clamped over one's nose. On the advice of old-timers, who had been in this camp for several days already, we received large jars of mustard per company in the kitchen. A few tablespoons of mustard somehow reduced the disgusting smell of the brew and made it relatively edible. We also received a quarter-pound of bread in the morning. The rations for the Red Army soldiers were much worse the same. Soup but once a day, without bread and without mustard. During the 3 days that we stayed in Bobruisk, the Germans twice made a disgusting spectacle where the privates were kept. They drove an old bony nag and offered it as meat to the prisoners. The soldiers threw themselves on the horse in crowds, killed it with sticks and stones, literally tore it to pieces with their hands, and cooked their food on the fires. One corner of the prison yard came close to the territory occupied by the soldiers, and some gentlemen officers, lovers of strong sensations, were going to watch the hunt here. Almost all the prisoners who were taken to the Bobruisk prison were from the 4th, 13th and 21st Armies, defeated by the Germans at the crossing of the Dnieper, but there were also commanders from other areas. Gradually, the general picture of the size of the German victory became clear. The Germans were at Kiev. They had the whole Baltic states in their hands. The Germans were approaching Leningrad. Odessa, their tank divisions were advancing with incredible speed to Moscow. Red Army broken, disorganized in panic, retreating along the entire line from the Baltic to the Black Sea, almost no resistance to the advancing. This information was reported mainly by company commanders, all of whom were extremely anti-Soviet, cursing Soviet power, the communists, the party and the father of nations, Stalin himself. They set the tone. During these few days, the entire mass of Red Army commanders, who had been captured, suddenly turned into ardent enemies of their country, where they were born, and of the government to which they had sworn allegiance and promised to defend their socialist homeland, to the last drop of blood until their last breath. To be addressed as Comrade Commander was punched in the face, if not more seriously beaten. Mr. Officer became mandatory in conversations. No one raised a voice in defense of what was called the Soviet Union, in the full scope of the term. No doubt there were quite a few Communist Party members among the prisoners, but all of them, sincerely or for reasons of camouflage, had turned anti-communist in the face of danger. It was like a dam bursting. Hungry, dirty, powerless, having lost their past and facing a completely unknown future, the Soviet commanders, with rapture at the top of their voices, were cursing the man at whose name they had stood up and applauded a week before Joseph Stalin. On the third day, according to the lists, during the morning inspection in the prison yard, almost 200 people were summoned. They were surrounded by a convoy, and the entire group was led out of the prison grounds. It turned out that they were Jews and political workers. We formed a close, friendly group, and we tried to stick together, me, Shmatko, Borisov, a young junior lieutenant, Kostya Suvorov, and two captains, Zivyalov and Skolsky. We all knew each other during the construction of border fortifications and during the retreat. Together it was somehow safer and more fun. It seems that on August 2nd, after the morning inspection and the first portion of porridge, the whole officers' camp was led out in a long column from the prison gates to the railroad station under heavy guard. We were loaded into a long freight train, 60 people per car. The wagons were completely empty, with a large, low-iron vat covered with a sheet of plywood in the centre and a barrel of water at the door. The windows in the wagon were shut tight. The doors slid open and locked from the outside, the train jerked, and off we went. We travelled almost non-stop. The doors were never opened. It was incredibly cramped inside, and there was a heavy stench of feces, sweat and dirt. There was not enough room for everyone to sit on the floor at once, so we sat down one by one, and some people felt sick. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon we were unloaded in Molodechno and were led to a row of 3-storied houses, apparently former barracks of the Soviet Border Guard unit that had stood there before the war. All the windows were broken, the doors were broken, and the walls had traces of shelling in many places. Everyone was lined up in the courtyard. 2 trucks brought unexpectedly good soup with pieces of meat and pasta, and a lot of fresh black bread. It was the first time we felt satiety, and it immediately affected the general mood. We were all, more than 2,500 men, sitting and lying on a large area in front of the barracks, surrounded by a considerable detachment of German soldiers with machine guns and machine guns pointed at us. There were no fences around. After 5 o'clock in the evening, we were again regrouped. A German captain appeared, and through an interpreter said that we would spend the night in these barracks, but only on the 2nd floor. It was strictly forbidden to go up to the 3rd or down to the 1st, as well as to approach the windows. The guards would shoot at every figure that appeared in the window aperture. For natural needs you can use the internal restrooms, which are in good order, and drinking water is available in the washrooms. This is how we spent the night. Inside the barracks was total chaos, overturned bunks, scattered things, torn mattresses, everything more or less valuable had been taken. Apparently, when the unit standing here, probably in a hurry, evacuated, the local population made a raid and carried away everything that could be taken. But I was lucky. Kostik Suvorov somewhere found a bale of laundered uniforms and brought me pants and overalls, quite decent looking and the right size. All night long the 2 barracks we occupied were illuminated from the outside by strong searchlights, and guard soldiers stood around. We made ourselves a nice soft bed of torn mattresses, and with a feeling of fullness in our stomachs we fell fast asleep. Only once during the night there were a few gunshots and loud shouts, but everything calmed down quickly, and we slept until the morning. In the morning we were built again and loaded into the wagons again, as if the same train that brought us to Molodechno yesterday. Before loading we were given half a pound of bread and brought hot bitter ersatz coffee. The same picture was repeated. tightness, stench from parashas, tightly closed doors and windows of cars, and again almost 5 hours of driving. By the afternoon we found ourselves in Baranovichi. It was difficult to understand the reasons for such a strange route of our echelon from Bobruisk to Molodechno, about 200 kilometers, from Molodechno to Baranovichi also 200, and from Bobruisk to Baranovichi in a straight line only 180. Why our echelon made such a seemingly unnecessary zigzag, only the Germans knew. We found ourselves in the city prison again. We were fed with liquid millet soup, but fortunately without rotten warbler, and placed in cells, where there was room for 50 people on the 2-story bunks. We were placed 100 at a time. The cells were locked just after 7 in the evening, and we were warned that we would be up early. At precisely 5 in the morning, all the locks and bolts on the cell doors were removed with a rattle, and everyone was ordered to immediately line up in the prison yard with their belongings. After half an hour of counting, shouting, confusion, and occasional slaps on the backs of stroppy or misunderstanding Mr. Officers, the longest column of 6 men in a row began to crawl out of the main gate of the prison and onto the road. Near the administration building stood a 2-story house filled with female prisoners. From the interpreters we learned that nearly 250 women were gathered here, mostly from the sanitary units, but there were also commanders, even in the rank of major. We also learned that in the whole convoy there were almost exactly 3,000 captured commanders. The German convoy was very numerous. On both sides of the column, almost a solid chain of soldiers with rifles and automatic rifles. In front and behind moved cars with machine guns. We were brought 2 railroad trains of freight cars and divided into groups of 50 people. Each group had to clean its own wagon, take out and wash the stinking, soiled parasha, sweep and wash the floor, and fill a barrel at the door with fresh water. Water for cleaning and drinking was brought up in cisterns. When all the work was finished, 25 small loaves of bread and 25 cans of canned meat were given to each wagon, i.e., for 50 men, of Soviet marching rations. With the indication that this was all we would receive for the whole day, we were loaded into the wagons and the windows and doors were again shut tightly. We were also warned that we would be travelling all day and would be placed in a special officers' camp by evening. The wagons were relatively clean and had enough room for everyone to sit on the floor. The cleaned parachutes did not poison the air, and the men satisfied their hunger a little. The far-sighted ones divided their rations into 2 parts, leaving some for the latter part of the day, while others, thinking less of the future, ate it all, drank water, and went to bed. It was clear that if by the end of the day we got to this officers' camp, it was located somewhere not more than 400 kilometers away, i.e., in the vicinity of Warsaw. We could not travel more in a day, and at night, according to the experience of the previous 2 days, the Germans did not transport us. The very name officers' camp sounded encouraging and promising. At last we will get to human conditions, we will wash, clean ourselves, they will feed us and let us sleep. The optimists said. We'll wait and see, doubted the pessimists. After 3 hours of riding, our train stopped, and the guards opened 5 cars at a time, giving people to stretch a little. The first echelon also stood half a kilometre ahead of us. Here we went again. The pessimists were right. We were unloaded from the wagons at a small station Podles, 15 kilometres from the town of Sedletsk. The first train was already empty. After a short march we came to a huge field cordoned off by wire fences with frequent wooden towers for guards. At the edge of this field stood several new barracks and cars of various sizes. Almost next to this centre was the officers' camp, 3 huge canvas tents, open latrines, i.e., simply long pits, rarely covered with boards, thick wire fences around, 2 towers with machine guns and searchlights facing the tents, and that was it. In the camp, the administration was waiting for us. The camp commandant, a lieutenant colonel, 3 petty officers, according to the number of tents, and about 30 policemen with white armbands on their sleeves. All Soviet officers. The foreman of our tent was a cavalry major, Grigory Stepanovich Skipenko. How and by whom this administration was selected, we never knew until the very end of our stay in this camp. We were placed in tents of 1,000 people, and the foreman of our tent immediately gave us a short lecture. Here is what he said: the camp is temporary. The food is the worst you can think of. Discipline is strict. It is not recommended to come closer to the fences than 20 paces. You can be shot. The Germans will shine searchlights and fire a couple of machine gun bursts into the air. As soon as it gets dark, they shoot at any shadows. Next to us is the camp for privates. There they have gathered more than 70,000 of them, just in the field. No more food tonight. Go to bed right after the first shots. Don't make any noise and don't show your nose outside until morning. Is that clear? Don't ask questions. I don't know the answers anyway. I even liked his short but very informative speech. Disappointed, tired, hungry and angry, with the first beams of searchlights and the first lines of machine guns running through the tents, that we all took refuge in the twilight of the tents and tried to fall asleep as soon as possible. It is necessary to say a few words about Major Grigory Stepanovich Skipenko, as he played a significant role in my life as a prisoner of war in the future. Once after a couple of days he came up to me, offered me a cigarette, and began to ask me about who I was and what I was doing before the war. He immediately determined that I was not a cadre, not a military man. A conversation started, and I began to ask him questions. He was a Cuban Cossack, about 40 years old, maybe more, strong, handsome, with shrewd brown eyes and slightly greying dark hair. After the revolution, he was mobilized into the army in the cavalry units, sent to military school, and after 2 years, was released in the rank of assistant squadron commander. He participated in the suppression of the Basmachi uprising and then, according to him, deliberately scandalized and, as an unreliable and morally decayed element, was thrown out of the ranks of the workers and peasants' Red Army. He worked as an accountant in the village collective farm management until the end of the 38th year. Again, he was drafted into the army and appointed an instructor for training conscripts in the Krivorochko Cavalry Corps. Despite his past, just before the war he was promoted to the rank of major and was appointed head of the Corps School for Training in Horseback Riding and Dizhititovka, a field in which he was considered an unsurpassed master, according to him. In the first days, the soldiers of Krivorochko's Corps units, concentrated north of Vinitsa, were thrown into a sabotage raid aimed at the flank of the German armies advancing on Kiev. There, near Turinsk, we did the Germans a lot of trouble. They did not expect such foolishness, said Skipenko, checkers and carbines against tanks and heavy infantry. By the end of the day they shot us. From the whole brigade, where I was, there were only a handful of survivors. When asked how he, who was captured on the southern section of the front, ended up among us, captured on the middle section, Skipenko evasively replied, "It just so happened." Immediately after the first conversations with Skipenko, two main sides of his mindset became apparent. He was an implacable anti-communist and an ardent Judeophobe, and in his understanding the entire system of Soviet power and the philosophy of communism were the creation of Jewry. Communist Jews, Jew power, the Jews have enslaved Russia. Everything that happened in Russia was the result of a conspiracy of the world Jew Kagul. All his statements, in one way or another concerning all that was left behind, were full of such expressions. In general, among the prisoners, this heightened Judeophobia and so-called anti-Semitism became a vivid manifestation of the general mood. This latent and severely persecuted by the Soviets, but very widespread in the mass of the population, feeling of identification of the Jews with communism and with the Soviet government came to the surface. The policy of National Socialism toward the Jews in general was not entirely clear at that time, but some people assured that the Germans not only isolated all prisoners of Jewish origin from the general population, but simply exterminated them. The subject of the Jews was one of the main topics all the time during our entire stay in Podles. During these 10 or 12 days, the entire officers' camp was twice lined up in front of the tents and German officers appeared. They demanded that all the Jewish prisoners come out. The first time more than 50 people came out. They were immediately taken away. The second time a few more came out. They were severely beaten by the Germans for not coming out at the first demand, and they were also taken away. In addition, every day, early in the morning and then before going to bed, a large group of Jews, working somewhere behind the camp, would pass by the camp on the road. Men, women, teenagers, and even old men walked by, with shovels, picks and rakes on their shoulders, ragged, dirty, miserable and tired. Circles of yellow cloth were stitched on the chest and back of their robes. In front and behind came 3 German soldiers each, and on each side healthy young boys, evidently from the local population, with white bandages on their sleeves, armed with whips and sticks. These escorts, with sadistic pleasure, kept beating people with sticks and whipping them with rods without any need to do so. The Germans did not pay any attention to the mockery going on. It was on this ground that my first clash with Skipenko took place. I expressed my indignation at the cruel mockery of innocent civilians. The reaction of Skipenko, who heard my words, was unexpectedly sharp, rude and threatening. He said, "I have been looking at you for a long time, Mr. Engineer, and what I see says that you are a principled defender of the Jews. What is that? Are you related to that carrion? Or are you an advocate of Jew ideas? We will check both. And in the meantime, shut your mouth, and don't spread pro-Judean propaganda here." The result of this superior's shout was immediate. For some time there was a kind of emptiness around me. Many people began to shun me. At my next visit to the sanitary unit, for dressing of a wound that had almost completely healed, the doctor unexpectedly examined the part of my body that could have given away my Jewish origin, if I had turned out to be a Jew. Many people went through such a medical examination. The senior interpreter in our camp was a tall, handsome lieutenant with a Georgian surname, nicknamed Dragoon. The food in the camp was very poor, or rather there was no food at all. They brought twice a day several barrels of liquid porridge with millet and potatoes on carts. The quantity of both decreased every day, and warm water remained. Bread, baked from a small amount of flour and some impurities, was brought on the same carts, sticky and spreading like porridge, because on the way the water from the barrels, which had no lids, splashed on it. Taking advantage of his position, Dragan concentrated his activities on trade. He took from prisoners watches, various pocket things, good boots, belts, overcoats and other things, and in return he brought bread, boiled potatoes, pots of liquid millet porridge, or some other food. For a loaf of bread I gave him my watch. The rainy weather began. The tents were leaking in many places. It was raining outside, and inside it was damp and cold. But compared to what was going on in the Red Army camp, we had a paradise. A dragoon told me the Red Army men are in a mess there. Almost 70,000 of them were gathered. No tents, no shelters, they are all soaked, hungry, huddled together in piles to keep warm somehow, many dead. The Germans themselves do not know what to do. They have no food, no wood for the kitchen or fires, no sanitary aid. After all, more than 70,000 people are here. This camp is an assembly camp. According to the plan, every day they should send from here in batches to stationary camps, but for more than a week there has not been a single shipment. It ended with an explosion. A few days after our arrival, after lights out, when it got dark, thousands of Red Army soldiers simultaneously rose up and with shouts, screams and wild roars rushed at the wire fence, fell it down and, under just hurricane fire from all the towers, it began to scatter in the darkness in the neighborhood. The sirens wailed, obviously to take revenge. Several machine gun lines were fired at our tents. 3 of us were wounded. A military unit arrived in a hurry, the area was cordoned off, and all night the shooting was heard. In the morning we were not allowed out of our tents. Germans were patrolling around each tent, and no food was brought. So, not knowing what was going on, we sat in the tents almost until the end of the day. Finally, we were allowed to go out. There were many German soldiers around the camp, outside and inside the tents, watching us warily. Only bread and a couple of barrels of cold coffee had been brought, but even that was greeted with great joy. From a distance we could see that masses of Red Army men were sitting on the ground, cordoned off by rows of Germans, while others were busy working to rebuild the barbed wire fence. The rain had stopped since morning, the Red Army had large fires burning, and people were drying their clothes there. Then it was told that more than 1,000 people had died in the escape. No one knew how many had managed to escape. The next day, a whole caravan of cars arrived, loaded with planks, firewood, plywood, various pieces of wood, and sometimes even parts of walls with windows and doors. Everything suitable was used to build sheds in the camp for the Red Army soldiers, and the rest for firewood. 2 large cars of such scrap wood were brought to our officers' block. Our bewilderment as to why they brought us this combustible material was dispelled very quickly in the following days, instead of Belander we were given. Raw millet. The Germans had run out of all supplies to feed 70,000 people. Fires were lit all over the camp, and the prisoners began to cook their own food. But unsifted millet is not easy to turn into something edible. It's a tricky one. Our group, as well as the others, started to strike work. Flat stones were found, and we all started grinding millet into flour and diverting the husks. The rest of the husks floated to the surface when the flour was poured with water and boiled over a fire. The result was millet flour chowder, to which we added wild sorrel, which grew in abundance on the plot, and some other herbs, which Borisov claimed were not dangerous to the human stomach. What was good was that the bread portion was almost doubled, and bread was brought dry, though it looked and tasted little like bread. Only the appearance of neat and ruddy brown loaves amused the eye. Such meals continued until our departure from Podles. On the last day at the morning inspection, an event occurred. Several German officers came again, and one of them, in Russian, addressed the ranks demanding that all political officers, commissars and political workers leave the ranks. He warned that he had a list, and those persons who did not come out at once would still be identified and severely punished. I stood in the front row, and could see how these unfortunate people came out of the ranks, as if they were going to be shot. There were unexpectedly many of them. Someone counted 109 people. When the last one left the ranks, the officer, who spoke Russian, said something quietly to two policemen with armbands on their sleeves who had come with him. Both of them approached our interpreter Dragon, who was standing next to the commandant of the block, and suddenly began beating him with short batons. Dragoon fell to the ground, but they continued to beat him brutally, mercilessly in front of the whole formation. Then they lifted him to his feet and, continuing to beat him, brought him to a group of political workers. The dragoon was covered in blood and moved bent over, holding his stomach with both hands. "Here is an example for you," said the officer. "A company commissar, a communist and a Jew. If there are any more such creeps among you, you must find them yourselves and throw them out of your ranks." The whole group, without even allowing them to take their belongings from their tents, were immediately led away under escort. The next day, after breakfast, i.e., a portion of bread and almost cold ersatz coffee, they ordered to line up with things. When the whole column, having left the officers' block, approached the main camp commandant's office, the endless roll check began, lasting until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was not until 3 o'clock that we again approached the two echelons made up of teplushkas and loaded 50 men per wagon. The doors were closed, and by the sound we realized that on the roof of our wagon, probably, of course, not only ours sat German convoys. The train jerked and rolled. This time we travelled not only for the rest of the day, but also for the whole night. We travelled slowly, with frequent stops. On the road we were not fed, we were not let out of the carriages, and only once we replenished the tanks with drinking water. Few people could sleep. It was cramped. There was a stench of parachute in the tightly closed carriage. Everyone was hungry like wolves, and like wolves, angry. Even conversations stopped, and if they started, they inevitably turned into angry bickering, or just an exchange of ugly swearing. It was almost daylight when the train started, the car doors opened, and the guards ordered everyone off. A long column, 6 men in a row, stretched through the not wide streets of the city. The population was not visible, whether it was too early or whether the inhabitants had been ordered. Not to appear on the way of the column, but there were soldiers all along the way. The convoy was in front and behind. The German soldiers were also walking on both sides of the column with rifles drawn, bayonets fixed, and were keeping a sharp lookout to see that no one was out of line or lagging behind. And surrounded by this mass of soldiers, in the middle of the sidewalk, walked almost 3,000 dirty, tired, ragged, overgrown with stubble, with dishevelled hair, hungry and completely demoralized Red Army commanders. Our column entered the square. On the right side was a large, ancient architecture building with wide semicircular staircases of the main entrance. There, at the entrance, stood 2 automobiles with machine guns, and on the top landing of the stairs a decent group of German officers. From the interpreters we learned that this intricate building with a tower was the town hall. The town was called Zamosc. Passing through the centre and turning several times through completely deserted streets, the column came to a barracks town, surrounded by 2 rows of barbed wire. The gates of the camp were wide open. Right against them in the yard stood a row of large metal tanks, and near each of them a German soldier with a large scoop in his hands. The prisoners would immediately line up at the tanks, and each would receive a full ladle of the thick, tantalizing-smelling hot brew. The Germans had hoped for normal human discipline, and wrong. In a few minutes each dispenser was surrounded by a solid ring of prisoners with outstretched walks, tin cans, or even just pilots and caps. Someone fell, someone screamed. The German dispensers began to beat the crowd that was pushing from all sides with balers. The soldiers of the convoy rushed to restore order, but no one listened to them. People were intoxicated with the smell of food, with the mere anticipation of the opportunity to satisfy hunger. Shots rang out. The crowd rushed away. The Germans beat people with sticks and rifle butts. Almost all the cans were overturned, and the food spilled in puddles on the sand. The whole mass of prisoners was pushed to the edge of the platform, and we stood in a dense crowd under the muzzles of rifles pointed at us. This went on for about 20 minutes. Then a tall, broad-shouldered, red-haired man in a neatly fitted Soviet commander's uniform, without insignia and wearing brightly polished boots, appeared. He ordered everyone to line up in Russian and, aligning the ranks, kept scolding us commanders, they call them. Bastard, rabble, sheep herd. Such a scandal. Stalin's falcons, of course, these epithets were accompanied by classical Russian mate. A group of German officers appeared in the courtyard. In front of them walked a red-haired elderly Oberlieutenant. In a strong, low voice he commanded attention and approached the Oberleutnant. For a few minutes they talked. Then the German stepped forward and through an interpreter said to us roughly the following. I am amazed at your total lack of discipline and dignity. I am ashamed that you wear the proud title of officer. I wanted to deprive you of all food for 24 hours, but I have been informed that you have had no food for the past 24 hours. You'll have your soup boiled again, and you won't get it till noon. It's your own fault what happened. Now you will be taken to your barracks, and I warn you that in our camp any breach of discipline is punished very severely. He turned abruptly and left with his entourage. We began to be led in groups to the barracks, but only a little less than half of us got into the barracks, because there were already many prisoners in the camp who had arrived before us. The other part was led in a line through the camp and placed in 2 huge stables, which stood at the end of the camp and were separated from it by an additional fence. I, with my group, got into stable No. 1. While we were settling in and looking around, they brought food. Lots and lots of it. We had such a sumptuous lunch for the last time in Molodechno. The camp in Zamosc was designed for 2,000 people, but when our replenishment arrived, up to 7,000 people were accommodated in this area. In the whole area there were 5 large barracks for 950 people, 5 small barracks for 150 people, 2 stables where almost 1,500 prisoners would live. In addition, there was the so-called generals' barracks, where several generals and colonels lived, a police barracks, a sanitary unit. For reasons that are not clear, all those who quite by chance got to the stables were isolated from the rest of the prisoners. The gates were closed, and a policeman was always on duty near them, letting in only those who went to receive rations for the stablesmen. The stables were almost new and apparently little used for their intended purpose, but in spite of the fact that all the internal equipment had been removed and the floor covered with a thick layer of fresh straw, the peculiar odour persisted. After a couple of days, all of us and all of our belongings were soaked in that aroma, and we got so used to it that we just stopped noticing. For our complete isolation from the rest of the camp, we had a separate latrine on the territory of the stables, similar to Podnesnenskaya's, i.e., just a long pit with boards over it. The commandant of the stables was an engineer colonel from the staff of the 21st Army Gorchakov. I talked to him more than once in Podles. His first administrative decision was to divide the whole mass of prisoners into groups of 50 men. Gorchakov appointed me as the chief of one of such groups. The duties of the head of the group were not difficult. The main thing was to get food for the group and to divide it fairly, equally. The composition of the group 50 people was dictated by the fact that the tanks in which soup was brought from the kitchen had a capacity of 50 litres. The food was relatively decent, especially in comparison with Bobruisk or Podles. Every day they were given 3/4 of a pound of quite edible bread, a litre of rather thick pearl soup with potatoes, rutabaga and traces of meat. In the morning and in the evening everyone received a litre of ersatz coffee, a tablespoon of borage jelly, a slice of sausage or processed cheese and 3 or 4 boiled potatoes. The worst scourge in the whole camp was lice. People were unwashed for a long time, in dirty, tattered uniforms, without haircuts and beards, and the lice were in unbelievable numbers. Most of the day had to be spent fighting these parasites. Under the rays of the already dim autumn sun, right after the morning inspection and breakfast, everyone stripped naked and tried to get rid of lice. They lit fires and held their underwear and clothing over the flames to scorch the parasites. Most of the prisoners' bodies were bitten by lice and scratched to the point of bleeding. After spending a few hours frying the lice, the next day they had to start all over again. The lice multiplied faster than they could be eliminated. After a week or 10 days our isolation suddenly ended. The policeman at the gate disappeared. The gate opened wide and no one prevented us from going to the main camp. The Germans had little to do with the internal administration of the camp. At the head of the camp stood the Russian commandant, who was also the chief of the internal police, selected from the prisoners. This commandant turned out to be the same large red-haired man who had restored order after the scandal that had broken out at our entrance to the camp, and his name was Colonel Gusev. Who he was, where and how he had been captured, who and why had appointed him full dictator and verdictor of the fates of the 7,000 population of the camp for the Soviet gentlemen officers, no one knew. His main assistants were the Galician Gordienko, a huge man of enormous stature, incredible physical strength, and grim appearance Yoko Polovoy, handsome as a movie actor, a very young, insolent, with obviously sadistic tendencies tank lieutenant, and Strelkov, an artillery captain, a small brunette with a dashingly twisted moustache on a ruddy face. At this main staff there was also a senior interpreter of the camp named Stepan Pavlovich. His surname was unknown to us, an elderly man like. A school teacher with a wedge beard and big glasses. This centre appointed cooks to the kitchen, commandants and policemen to each individual barrack, controlled the distribution of food, the work of the sanitary block, work assignments, etc. The barrack commandant appointed room superintendents and was fully responsible for order in his barrack. In the separate 4-room barrack, no. 12-1 room was occupied by Gusev and Stepan Pavlovich, and in the other 3 rooms lived, I think, 7 generals and 15 colonels. The most senior in rank was Lieutenant General Karbyshev. The population of this 12th barrack did not show themselves at all in the camp yard, and the entrance to the barrack for outsiders was strictly forbidden. The generals and several colonels were taken out of the camp about a month after our arrival, and in this barrack of the senior command staff lived the remaining colonels, lieutenant colonels, and some majors. Nobody offered me a place there. When it became possible for us stable men to walk all over the camp, I met some acquaintances, and among them was Nikolai Kochagin, a Kiev engineer who had been captured in the first days of the war near Korostin. With his help I was able to move from the stables to the barracks, and not only myself, but took with me Zavyalov, Borisov and Suvorov, who had become my close friends during those weeks of captivity. The commandant of the 4th barrack was a certain Ovchinnikov, a military engineer of the 2nd rank, i.e., a lieutenant colonel. Ovchinnikov and a few of his buddies decided to create an improved atmosphere in the room where they lived and filled it with a mostly intellectual crowd. Almost everyone here was college-educated, engineers, economist teachers, scientists, lawyers, etc., and everyone was polite, correct, and friendly. The first time was extremely pleasant. I was resting from almost 2 months of cohabitation with a rude mass of losing human form. Dirty, intemperate, incessantly swearing army men. Soon, however, the negative sides of this intellectual environment became apparent. There, among the cadres, rudeness, boorishness and demoralization reigned, but all this was extremely sincere. Everyone was hungry, angry, cursing what was left behind and what was now. But here, among the 56 representatives of the intelligentsia, one could sense naivety, falsity, and perhaps hypocrisy. Emphasized courtesy in address, with the obligatory polite arguments, careful words, and slippery expressions of their thoughts. "I'm sorry, but I can't agree with you, sir. Thank you, sir. It was all so exaggerated and so out of keeping with the moment and the surroundings that it was starting to get on my nervous system." It was as if the whole room smelled of the strongest odor of mothballs from things taken out of the chests of the last century. Besides, behind all this outward courtesy and politeness, one could feel a complete lack of trust in the interlocutor or bunkmate. Just as in the Soviet Union, it was always necessary to remember the limits of permissible deviation from the general line. So here, in the room of the sub-Soviet intelligentsia, there were already both new limits of permissibility and a new general line drawn by Gusev and his assistants. The creators of this new general line, the camp police, did not hesitate to rob everyone. They took everything of any value. If a person did not resist, they would give him a piece of bread or a pot of police spill for the taken thing. But if he resisted, they would beat him, take him away, and give him nothing. I had good commander's boots, which I had received when I was reclothed after Zobin, and of course they were noticed. One day Captain Strelkov came up to me. "Hey, Major, sell the boots. I'll give you a loaf of bread and soldier's kurzes." I declined the offer, but Strelkov insisted. "That's the price for today, and tomorrow you'll get a kick in the teeth in payment." I was advised to accept the generous offer, and when Strelkov reappeared, I told him, "Take the boots, for 2 loaves and Kurzov boots." Strelkov looked at me. "Wow." "You agreed. And why do you look like a Jew? Are you of Jew blood? Come with me, let's check your document. Maybe I'll get your boots for free." He took me to the sanitary unit. "Doctor, check, suspicious doctor." Ishenko, whom Kochagin had introduced me to a day or two before, pretending to see me for the first time, made an appropriate check and wrote on a piece of paper, after a medical examination of Mr. Major Pyotr Palya, "It has been established that his foreskin is not circumcised, but so he is not a person of the Jewish religion." Dr. S. Eshenko. September 14th, 1941. Strelkov looked at the certificate and, shaking his head, said, "Too bad. I'll have to pay for the boots, and you still look like a Jew. Keep that document with you. It may come in handy again." He took the boots, and in the barracks I ate all the bread with my friends, celebrating the fact that I had foreskin, not circumcised, and began to flaunt my Kurzov boots, worn but intact. Everyday life in the camp was getting worse and worse. The terror of the police was increasing, and the food that was given out was getting worse. Cereal in Balanda had completely disappeared, and potatoes and rutabagas were often found completely rotten. Real hunger began to be felt more and more. The worst place in the camp was Barrack No. 5. There were always policemen on duty in front of the barracks, and no one was allowed near the doors or windows. Every morning from all 3 rooms of the barracks the prisoners took out the parashas, emptied them into the cesspool, washed them at the well, and carried them back to their rooms. The appearance of the inhabitants of Barrack No. 5 was horrifying, dirty, in rags, half naked, with bruises on their bodies and faces, with eyes in which horror froze. The Polizei, under whose supervision the operation of taking out the parasha was carried out, used to compete with each other in swearing and beating these prisoners. This daily spectacle made a depressing impression even on the prisoners who were already accustomed to everything. All those who were hunted in the camp by the police and their voluntary helpers were gathered in this barracks. The police, by position, and the volunteers out of love for art and for a pot of grub from the bar table. They hunted for political instructors, commissars, NKVD officers, and of course for people of Jewish origin, children of mixed marriages. Almost every day it was possible to see how from some barrack the police dragged out another victim and, beating him on the way, took him to that damned Barrack No. 5. Volunteers would creep into the confidence of the suspicious and in intimate conversations about home, family and pre-war work would pry out a terrible secret: he was married to a Jewess. Mother or father, grandmother or grandfather were Jews. That was enough. The victim was beaten by the police, and the informer received a pot of soup or an extra ration of bread, The commandant of this barrack was a certain Mr. Georgie, as most people called him. We did not know his last name. He was a man of about 50 years of age, with a very genteel appearance, with a small greyish beard, calm dark eyes and a constant soft smile on the full, bright lips of a small, almost feminine mouth. He was always dressed in a very decent civilian suit and shirt and tie. He was a friend of Gusav's and Stepan Pavlovich's chief interpreter. He was not on the list of prisoners and lived not in the camp, but on the side. There were different rumours about him. They said that he was the son of a priest, that he was arrested in the 20s and spent many years in high-security camps in Siberia. He walked with a limp, but without a stick. The policeman called him Batya Georgie. He usually came to the camp in the afternoon, sat in Gusev's room for 2 or 3 hours, playing chess with Stepan Pavlovich, and then in the evening went to his barracks to work. He would enter one of the 3 rooms, accompanied by 2 of his assistants, and soon from there would be heard the screams and shrieks of people who were evidently being tortured or beaten. He would spend an hour or more in each room, and then, with the same smile and calm eyes, he would walk slowly through the camp and away to the German commandant's office. He was by nature a sophisticated sadist and, interrogating the unfortunates, used all manner of torture. Everyone knew that. When the barracks were full, 2 trucks with a small detachment of SS men would arrive and all the prisoners would be taken away, to be shot, of course. 318 people passed through the hands of this sadistic psychopath in the fall of 1941. My acquaintance Kolya Kochagin also died in Barrack No. 5. It was said that his mother was a baptized Jewess and that he was handed over to the police by Dr. Ishenko, the head of the sanitary unit, who was also from Kiev and knew Kochagin from the labor school, where they studied together. In the middle of November, they finished building the bathhouse. All the population of the camp for a whole week passed through sanitization. Heads were shaved naked and all the hair on the body, where they were supposed to grow, all washed in the bathhouse with hot water and liquid, toxic-smelling soap, and the clothes were fried in special chambers, and in the whole camp for several days there was a special smell of fried dirt and burnt lice. But the nutrition worsened every day. I became visibly weaker. In the morning it was difficult to get up from the bunks. I felt dizzy, and an obvious psychological depression was developing more and more strongly. It was a very dangerous state. Many people slipped into this abyss and slowly died. Their philosophy was that the amount of calories they received did not allow any physical activity, so they spent all their time lying on the bunks, coming down only to check, to get rations and to perform natural needs. And some even stocked up on utensils for these needs and came down only to empty the utensils. They were literally rotting on the bunks alive. It took me a great effort of will not to be among them. I forced myself to wash, shave, walk, even do gymnastics and volunteered for any work in the camp. It helped. Then it became a habit to do something all day long, and to spend only a minimum of time on the bunks to sleep. One morning, after checking, the barracks commandant told me that from Monday all the junior lieutenants living in the other 2 rooms of our barracks would go to the German warehouses for work, and that he wanted to appoint me the head of one of the rooms. The room foreman would at the same time be the brigadier of such a team, to assign, to work, to keep order, to maintain discipline, and to allocate to the camp administration, i.e. to Gusav and his cronies, a certain portion of the booty. You realize that everyone and everything that can be stolen will be stolen. When you return from work, the police will not search, but the police have free entrance to the rooms, and if they suspect and are found to be harbouring stolen goods, there will, of course, be great trouble both for the workers and for the head of the room. Will you accept such a job? I gladly agreed. Firstly, leaving the room of rotten intellectuals. Secondly, constant work, activity, responsibility, and finally, thirdly, the likelihood of sometimes being fed. How not to agree? On Sunday I took command over room 2 of our barracks and a work brigade of junior lieutenants, and on Monday 2 brigades, from each room of 25 men, went to work behind the wire. Before this, the night before, I had told my subordinates about the conditions of our work and our duties to the high command of the camp, which Ovchinnikov had told me about. As we walked through the town under escort of a dozen soldiers, ragged, dirty and thin as skeletons, The inhabitants stopped and looked at us with pity. Once I heard a woman say to another in Russian, "Where are they taking them, the wretches?" Apparently, there were many Russian people living here in the centre of Poland. We were assigned to work in small groups of 5 to 6 people. Some worked on loading bales with uniforms, others, the majority, on unloading rollers of barbed wire. A few people shifted blankets in the warehouse, and only one group got the job of packing individual packets of marching rations. But there the Germans watched every movement of the prisoners, and it was impossible to conceal anything, hide it in a pocket or send it to the mouth. The team leader, in this case me, did not have to work and could walk freely from one group to another, keeping an eye on order. Everyone became despondent. The hope to grind something obviously did not come true. However, at 12 o'clock in the afternoon everyone was given a piece of good bread, a couple of galettes, a decent piece of sausage, and hot coffee. The field officer in charge of food distribution said that from tomorrow they would give soup here at work. Everyone's mood was lifted. I was walking through the courtyard, past some Polish workers repairing the sidewalk, and one of them made a sign to me. I paused and realized he was pointing to a small bag lying in the grass by the road a little ahead. Passing by and making sure that none of the Germans were looking in my direction, I picked up the bag. There were 2 pieces of bread, a thick slice of pork lard, and a packet of Polish fudge, so-called Grodno fudge. Returning along the same path, I quietly said to the working Poles, "Dziękuję panowie," in reply I heard, "Eat to your health. May God protect you," in pure Russian. I paused and wanted to say something, but one of the workers warned me go on without stopping. "We are strictly forbidden to speak to you." Suddenly I had an idea to pass a note to my relatives through them. I stepped aside, took out the list of the workers of the team, and pretending to mark something in it, wrote on a scrap of paper, "I am a prisoner of the Germans, in Zamosc, as long as I am alive in good health. We will soon be taken to Germany," and signed and dated it. I wrote the address of my grandmother, Aunt Mother, because I was quite sure that she had not evacuated with the Reds. She continued to live in her small apartment in Kiev on Pushkinskaya Street. Then he took another sheet and wrote on it, "Kind people, if possible pass this note to my family, so that they would know that I am alive. Thank you." When I passed by the people working on the sidewalk again, I threw the note on the ground, and then I saw one of them pick it up and put it in his pocket. After this incident, I never saw these people in the warehouses where we worked. Already after the war, in Germany, I met with acquaintances from Kiev, and they told me that after Christmas 1942, some railroader came to my grandmother and brought my note, which was given to him by a driver who drove trains to Poland and back. The kind people turned out to be really kind. When we returned to the camp after work, we were given the dinner we were supposed to have, and in addition, a better lunch. It was the same camp meal, but much thicker, with a clear presence of pearl groats. Immediately after bedtime, the senior policeman, Yoka Polovoy, came to our room with 2 of his handmaidens. In both rooms of the junior lieutenants there were no bunks. They slept on the floor in rows. Only for the eldest room there was a long table, which served as a bed. The prisoners also slept under the table. Yoka was dressed in a good commander's suit. On his hands he had brown gloves, and on his feet my boots taken from me by Strelkov. They must have been too small for Strelkov, I thought. Polovoy walked across the room among the prisoners and ordered, "Get under the walls. Labourers." Face me, everyone hastily obeyed the order. Polovoy had a bull in his hand. It was a favourite weapon of the police, a bull's penis, especially dried and dissected. The blow left a long, very painful bruise at a light blow, and a bleeding blue scar at a stronger one. Anything sludulated, take it out of your pockets and put it at your feet. All of it. Understand? If I find who cheated, I'll wash it in blood. Now, the booty was pretty pathetic: a dozen apples, some raw carrots, a few small jars of canned meat, and quite a few bags of cookies from individual marching rations. That's it. Why so little? Hey, XO. The fieldman turned to me. You. He swore at me. What were you watching? Don't you realize your responsibility? He came close to me and looked at the pack of fudge and a couple of galettes I had left, which the Germans had given us in the warehouse. Looked me in the eye, and I thought he wanted to hit me. but he didn't. Wow, you figured out Grodninskaya. It's bad for you to smoke, you're so skinny. Polovoy stepped on a packet of makorka and spread it on the floor. For your own good, you wretch. Stop smoking, he walked across the room and in 2 places deliberately stepped on the galettes lying on the floor. One of the prisoners exclaimed, "What are you doing, Yurka?" "You've crumbled the galettes. After all, this is food." Polovoy turned and with his left hand slapped the prisoner, and then with his right, armed with an exotic whip, struck the unfortunate man on the shoulder. "Stand still, you bastard," and hit him again. "I'm not Yurka to you, mister." Senior policeman Yuri Vasilievich Polovoy. "Do you understand?" "Say it again, bitch." "That's better. Remember." The policeman took everything except the galettes and carrots. Leaving, Polovoy came to me again. "Why did you work so badly? We worked at unloading barbed wire. And what to take it for? We have plenty of it here already." I grinned crookedly. "You're joking." "Look, don't make too many jokes. Next time if you do, I'll have other jokes with you." He left, accompanied by his adjutants. "Is that clear to everybody?" I asked. "Tomorrow the second group will have to meet the demands of the superiors. Otherwise we'll all be in trouble." Everyone spoke at once. "Why the devil to get along? You risk being caught by the Germans there. If you bring it, the police will take it away. There's nothing to carry into the camp. Everything goes straight into your stomach. I'd like to beat their faces and throw them out of the barracks. Let them go to work themselves. Look at you. You're so brave. They'll beat you up. And if you stay alive, you'll rot in the sanitary unit. We have no way out anyway. Ride, enemy, as you wish. We have to organize ourselves somehow." "Hey, senior, your word, my position was quite dangerous. I knew very well what kind of jokes I could have with Mr. Senior Policeman Yuri Vasilievich Polev if somehow I didn't satisfy his demands. And I told my subordinates that as long as we worked in the warehouses, we would not be hungry. That was the main thing. And in order for us to be able to work there, we had to bring something to the police. Eat everything at work, and bring it here to the camp only for the police. We can't punch anyone in the face. The police will deal with us very brutally. One room can't fight the camp system. If the whole camp would rise up against the abuse and arbitrariness of Gusev and his company, something could be changed. But even the generals are standing at arm's length before Gusev, and they could make some kind of organized protest to the Germans. Maybe it will happen someday, but for now we can only hobble along and keep quiet." I gathered as much makorka as I could, smoked and went to bed on my desk. But I couldn't sleep for a long time. I kept thinking about that handsome Polovoy and his police comrades. What sort of people were they? Why do they have such a beastly hatred for prisoners, for their own recent comrades in regiment division, to their fellow countrymen, from the same towns or villages, who went through the same school, the life of a Soviet citizen, as they did? Maybe a deeply thinking psychologist could explain the actions. F the psychopath sadist Mr. Georgie by revenge for what he had experienced in the Katsets, to those unfortunate people in Barrack, no. 5, who as it were represented his enemies and persecutors, the Cheka, the NKVD, the Soviet authorities, but how to explain the actions of the camp police. What were these people, Lieutenant Polovom, Captain Strelkov, Colonel Gusevay and their kind, taking revenge for, and to whom? These boys, junior lieutenants. All this mass of prisoners turned into a hungry, frightened flock of sheep, obedient to the shout of any Mr. Policeman? Somehow it was all incomprehensible, illogical and disgusting. At the beginning of our life in the Zamosc camp, someone said that the camp police were NKVD agents specially sent to the camps to create such living conditions here that life in the camp would be worse than death in battle. Many people believed this, and to a certain extent they had reason to believe it. The same system of brutal terror, the same elite organization of a small group of chosen ones who rob the masses and live like a poisonous parasite on the body of the masses, the same chiefism of one of them, whose word is absolute law, the same network of sex conspirators and sycophants, penetrating the whole mass of prisoners and spreading fear and distrust of others, the impossibility of organization and the desire somehow to be obscured, to hide, to disappear. But how in such a short period of time could the NKVD, from the depths of the USSR, organize such an effective system in our Zamosc and probably in other similar camps in Poland, at a great distance from the war line. I shared my thoughts with Borisov and Zavyalov. They too had already thought about it, and Borisov, on confirmation of our suspicions, told me that one prisoner working as a janitor in Giusev's room, as if he had heard Giusev say in a conversation with one of his assistants that when the war was over and those who survived the captivity would be returned home, there they would be put in the garden by the skin for treason. On another occasion, one polizei, beating a guilty wretch in something, said, "Did you think that captivity was salvation? No, brother, you were wrong. You'll remember Kolyma as a paradise these rumours spread around the camp in spite of their monstrousness, or perhaps because of it." The teams of junior lieutenants continued to go to work. The men had grown noticeably stronger, cheerful, and had learned to maneuver between possible punishment from the Germans in the warehouses if they were caught stealing, and the inevitable beating from the camp police if they did not pick up their share. Everything that could be eaten was eaten on the spot: dry and fresh fruit, canned meat, cheese, sausage, cookies, sometimes chocolate, and once even managed to sneak a bottle of cognac, especially for Mr. Chief of Camp Police Colonel Gusev. I went with the brigade to work in turn with the head of the other room, a very unpleasant Captain Yagnenkov, who certainly had a strong connection with the police, and especially with a certain Biryugin, one of the most brutal oprichniks of Yurka Polovoy. I became stronger, healthier, fed myself and fed my comrades as best I could, leaving them my official rations in full and sharing what I managed to sneak through the two cordons, the German one in the warehouses and the police one in the camp. But I began to be overcome by boils. They appeared here and there for no apparent reason. A few days after we started working in the warehouses, 2 boils appeared on my left arm, both below the elbow. They grew to the size of a Valoche walnut. The arm swelled up, turned purple, and formed 2 cones with dirty yellow pus tops. The pain was in the whole arm from wrist to shoulder, and the boils themselves could not be touched. I had to go to the sanitary unit to Dr. Ishchenko. Seeing me in the waiting room, among the 24 waiting in line, Ishchenko called me into his office, was attentive and kind to the extreme. He opened both abscesses, cleaned the craters, lubricated them with disinfectant ointment, bandaged my hand and gave me medicine. While dealing with my arm, he kept talking about Kiev, trying to find common acquaintances. In farewell, he said that I could come to see him when it was convenient for me and without any cue. The larceny broke simply as I was leaving. He shook my hand and said, "I heard that you are in command of a work brigade of junior lieutenants. That's wonderful, good for you, it will save you from starvation. By the way, I'd be very grateful if you could slip me something, like some sugar." I promised, and thought to myself, if I find out that it was you who played a dirty part in the story with Kochagin, I will try to give you some sugar, not sugar, but strychnine. In the camp, all the time worked quite a large group of scribes and interpreters engaged in the census of prisoners. They called them room by room, wrote down all personal data, occupation, nationality, religion, education, and so on. They said that all this was necessary for the future work of the prisoners first in Germany, and after the complete defeat of the Judeo-Communist government in the USSR, for the organization of the new order there at home. I was summoned to such commissions 3 times, as a major, as an engineer, and as a Ukrainian. The entire population of Room No. 1, headed by Ovchinnikov, was transferred to Barracks No. 1, the outermost one at the fence facing the street, and the room that was vacated was occupied by communicators gathered from all over the camp, as if to be sent to work as soon as possible. In the first days of November I stayed in the camp. It was Yagnenkov's turn to lead the team to work. Before dinner, a messenger from the commandant's office came and said, "Bring your things to the 13th Barrack. Report to the commandant immediately." The 13th Barrack. For a whole week people had been moved into it according to some lists from the German commandant's office. They said that a large group was being assembled to be sent to Germany, and that this time the matter was quite serious. They even said that this group would leave for work before Christmas. I was overjoyed. At last I would get out of this cursed pit, out of Zamosc, somewhere in the fresh air, to people, to work, to human conditions of life and food. Having told the commandant of the barracks about my transfer to the 13th, I ran into the first barrack to say goodbye to my friends Borisov and Zavialov. A few people from this barrack were also called to the 13th, most of them people with technical education. We said goodbye warmly and cordially. For these few months we had become real, trusted friends. The commandant of Barrack, no. 13 turned out to be my old acquaintance from Podnesia Cossack Major Skipenko. He looked at me glumly, and having made a mark in the list, said, "Here we meet again, Mr. Engineer. In the 7th room there is a senior Captain Strelkov. He will suit you." I did not like this combination at once. Commandant Skipenko and the senior captain in the room, Strelkov, were exactly the kind of people with whom I had no desire to communicate. Strelkov, of course, recognized me at once and greeted me with a grin. "My dear friend, what a joyful meeting. And you cheated me with the boots, they were too small. I had to resell them." Strelkov was the senior in 3 rooms, no, 5, 6 and 7, but for some reason he settled down in our room, no, 7. There were no bunks in the rooms, and everyone slept on the floor, as we did in the 3rd barrack. Outsiders were not allowed into the barracks, and we were ordered not to hang around the camp either. In the morning we all went through the bathhouse, were given a set of very decent underwear, and then uniforms. The uniforms, scattered, mostly Red Army, but clean, whole and disinfected, were issued per room, so many pants, so many gymnastics, overcoats and shoes, and so all the time after lunch we were busy fitting and exchanging what we received, trying to match the size. I was worried that Strelkov too often pestered me with conversations and jokes, asking me about my family and my former pre-war work, asking my opinion about the causes of the war, about the future structure of Russia, or why do I consider myself a Ukrainian. Before going to bed, after dinner, which we got about twice as much as usual, Strelkov picked on me again with some questions. I made myself cozy with all my belongings in a corner of the room, laying my clean, disinfected-smelling overcoat on the floor, and putting my gas mask bag with all my belongings under my head. I wanted to sleep. "Here you are, Major Engineer, educated Ukrainian. As you say, I wonder how you think the national question will be solved when the Kremlin Jew power is destroyed. Listen, gentlemen, to the opinion of a representative of the intelligentsia." "I couldn't stand it. Listen, Strelkov, go to some mother of your own choice when we destroy it. Then we'll think about it. There's enough time for that. Now don't disturb me and others to sleep." Angry. "All right, we'll talk afterwards. And you still smell like a Jew, even though you're uncircumcised. Sleep while you're still alive." I covered myself with my head, and despite the premonition of trouble, soon fell asleep. In the morning, after the inspection, which was done by Skipenko himself with a German non-commissioned officer, breakfast was distributed, also in much larger quantities than usual. I had not yet had time to finish my portion when Strelkov appeared. "Come with me, the commandant summons you." Come on, finish it later. Turn around, friend." Uncircumcised. I followed him, fully aware that I was in trouble. We entered the barrack commandant's room. On the bed, right against the door, sat Skipenko, by the window stood the gorilla like Gordienko, and by the table on a stool sat Yurka Polovoy. On the other bed sat side by side the chief interpreter, Stepan Pavlovich, and another politsai. "Stand here." Strelkov pushed me to the middle of the room. The politsai who sat next to Stepan Pavlovich stood up, walked to the door, closed it, and leaned his back against the door. There was clearly something threatening in the whole atmosphere and in the faces of those present. "That's the sub, the head of the junior lieutenant team. I know him." Skipenko leaned back against the wall and lit a cigarette. Everyone was silent. "Now answer the questions, and no bullshit." Strelkov came close to me. "Who in your family was a Jew? Did you say that the Soviets would win the war anyway? Did you say that the Jews were tortured in vain?" I looked at Skipenko. He was sitting with his head down on the palms of his hands resting on his knees. "Was the Jew Kochagin a pal of yours?" "Why didn't you inform me that he was a Jew?" I didn't have time to answer. "You, uncircumcised bastard, persuaded in your room to beat up the representatives of the camp police. Hear him, Polovoy. Did you propose to go to the generals and demand an official complaint to the Germans? Did you agitate the junior lieutenants to revolt? Did you order them to eat everything at work and not to bring anything to the camp? Are you not comfortable with National Socialism? Are you a communist? A member of the party? Strelkov, not waiting for my answers, grabbed me by the collar of my gymnasium jacket and yanked it hard at every question. End the bazaar, Strelkov said Skipenko, without raising his head, continuing to smoke. Go, take your junk, and get out of the barracks. And don't let me see you, you Judean patron Strelkov, let me out of his arms. Well, thank God. At least without a fight, I thought with relief, and, turning to Skipenko, asked, is it what? Officially, did the German commandant's office authorize you, Mr. Commandant, to cross me off the list? Skipenko raised his head and looked at me curiously. Everyone laughed, you scum. Here's a sanction for you, and Strelkov slapped me. Badly thinking about what I was doing, I stepped on his foot with my left foot and hit him from bottom to top in the chin with 2 fists. An old, tried and true youthful technique in a fight. Strelkov fell to the floor, and Gordienko, Polovoy and the 3rd policeman came at me at once. Under their blows I spun around the room, and in a moment was knocked down. Someone kicked me in the face. A couple more blows and I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I didn't realize what had happened. It was completely dark, my whole body hurt, my mouth had a disgusting, nauseating salty taste. I was lying on something soft and nasty smelling, and I was covered with a stiff material on top. I wanted to throw it off me, but the effort and pain made me pass out again. Then I regained consciousness again. My body continued to ache, but my head began to think better somehow. At first it seemed to me that I was blind. I felt my eyes. They were completely swollen. With difficulty I opened them through narrow slits and began to look around. Now I fully remembered what had happened. Where am I? Where did they take me? I tried to think. I was lying on my back, there was a cold wall on my right side, and someone was sleeping on my left. I wanted to sit up, but I didn't have the strength. I could only lift my head a little. Apparently I was on a bunk in some barracks. It was getting light outside, and the faint light coming through the window illuminated the long row of sleepers on the left side. The light was coming from below, and the ceiling was unexpectedly close. Apparently. I was on the top tier of the bunks, on the very edge, in some kind of barracks. How did I get here? Who brought me here? What barrack? I shifted restlessly, trying to sit up on the bunk. And my icon, is it gone? I was frightened, fumbling with my hand on my chest, and fumbling for the image, calmed down. This small enamel icon with the image of Jesus Christ was hung around my neck by a young Polish woman on the day when I went to the front line at the defense of Zhobin. I had a special, sentimental and superstitious attitude to this icon, and every time in difficult moments I put my hand behind my back, took the icon between my fingers, and it had a calming effect on me. When I was first lightly wounded by a mine fragment in the trenches near Zhobin, the icon was wounded with me. A piece of enamel broke off and got into my wound. My neighbor woke up and, raising himself up, looked me in the face. In the semi-darkness I recognized him, Zavyalov. Thank God. You're awake. Now you'll get better. Which barracks is this? The first. All our engineering company from the 3rd is here. Don't spin around, please. Drink this. The doctor said to give it to you at once when you wake up. If you wake up. I took a few sips with difficulty. My whole face was puffy and my lips felt kind of stiff. What did they do to me? Broken bones? I asked, groping my face. No, the doctor said they weren't intact. Which doctor? Ishchenko? No, another, an Armenian. Shigarian is his name. Zavyalov. Tell me everything in order later, after we get up and check, but for now you lie quietly. Thank God you're alive. The inspection was not by name, but by count. The inspection was done by Colonel Bikarovich. I recognized him by his voice, an unusually low bass. I heard him ask, "How's that Major? Is he still alive?" Someone replied, "Alive, he seems much better. Well, let him lie down," murmured Bikarovich. After the inspection, the visitors began to climb the bunks one after another. Borisov, Kostik, Suvarov, Ovchinnikov, Tarasov, Shmatko. They congratulated me on being alive. I heard one of the visitors, down on the floor, say he's a tough guy. I was sure he'd die. Zavialov brought some brew, a kind of liquid porridge I ate, took the medicine again, and fell asleep. I awoke when it was already dusk. Borisov was sitting on the edge of the bunk, and I touched him with my foot. "Are you awake, Nikolaevich?" "Well, better." "It seems better, certainly better," I answered. "Listen, how did I end up here in your barracks?" "I don't remember anything. The last thing I remember is at Skipenko's. They started beating me. Do you want to know all the details?" "Better, when you're stronger." "I'll tell you," but I insisted. Borisov first got down from the bed and brought me the same liquid porridge again. And then a young, Oriental-type man climbed up to me. "I'm Doctor Shigarian. How are you?" He took my temperature, felt my pulse, smeared something on my abrasions and bruises, and climbing down, said everything is fine. "Take this medicine all day tomorrow. The day after tomorrow I'll come again. Don't go to the sanitary unit yourself. Your body is strong, dear Major, very strong. The only loss is, I think, 3 teeth. You got off cheap." He left, and I asked Borisov to give me a mirror. He reluctantly handed it over. "I don't want to spoil my own mood," he said. Indeed, one could spoil one's mood. The whole face was ugly swollen, especially the right side. The lip was split, teeth were knocked out, the ear was torn, and there were continuous sizio-black and greenish streaks on the forehead, on the cheeks, and on the neck. "Yes, painted," I mumbled, handing over the mirror. "Well, now that the results are known, tell me what you know. You left in the 13th on Tuesday, and on Wednesday morning one of our men came running in and said that you had been killed by the Polizei. And what day is today?" I interrupted him. "Saturday." "Well, we decided to check it out, of course. My buddies went to Barrack 13. There they were told that I was in the sanitary unit. They went to the sanitary unit. At first the orderlies wouldn't let them in, but they shouted, 'Doctor.' Ishchenko came out to them and said that I was dead and my body was in the dead room. They returned to the barracks. The funeral service was held and unanimously decided that you were a good guy then. At Zavialov's suggestion, they decided to go to say goodbye to the body, according to Christian custom, before the corpses were taken to the graves in the morning. The whole group went. The watchman and the dead room were not allowed to pass. They bargained and, having given a whole packet of Grodno Mahorka, went into the shed where the corpses were lying. Borisov suddenly coughed and, getting down from the bunk, said, "Let someone else finish the story." In the dead room there were 8 corpses, neatly stacked in 2 layers and covered with tarpaulins. They pulled back the tarpaulin, and I was lying on top. My face was bruised, blood caked on my lips, my eyes closed with swollen eyelids, dead. Borisov took off his cap, crossed himself and kissed me on the forehead, and suddenly he shouted, "He's alive." "He's warm," they felt my pulse weak. "But it's there." "They took me out of the barn," they shouted. The guards came. The policeman on duty. Everyone was frightened. Even in Zamosc they didn't bury alive people together with corpses. Ishchenko came, also frightened. He signed the death certificate for the commandant's office. They brought me to the sanitary unit. Ishchenko cleaned up, and Dr. Shigarian washed my wounds, disinfected them, bandaged them, gave me injections, injected medicine into my mouth. He was afraid of a fracture in his skull. This Shigarian advised to take me to a barracks, away from the police. My friends went to the commandant of their barracks, Baikovich, and got permission. Thanks Shigarian, he came 3 times a day. Even Gordienko came by once, asking, "Is that Major alive?" When he found out he was alive. He decided, well, he's alive, big guy, so everything's legal. You're enrolled in the 11th room of the 1st barracks officially. So, when I woke up for the first time, I was the one who was there with the corpses under the tarpaulin. What could I say? Anything I would have said would have been too little. If it wasn't for my friends, they'd have buried me alive. "Thank you," I said, barely holding back tears. A few days later, still with a swollen and painted in all colours of the rainbow face, I could, overcoming the pain, get down from the bunk and independently move around the camp. Once, coming out of the restroom, I pushed face to face with Gordienko. He grinned, and, looking at me with empty grey eyes, said Divi, "Vychichavsia, I'm sure you have cysts from the back of your head. Go away, or I'll try again how they hum."